I'm fairly sure that everything I'm about to say has probably been said already hundreds, if not maybe thousands of times, but I'm going to say it again anyway. The last thing I want this video to be right now is an angry rant. I was determined not to make an angry rant or something of that type about Cyberpunk and the situation it's in. I want to talk more, about the video game industry at large and how this is very much a systemic problem. And we've been here before. Cyberpunk isn't the first studio to have this kind of problem. It is the first studio to have it on this scale. Obviously, I've never seen it. And let's get the obvious stuff out of the way. I've never seen, blowback this bad for a game release ever. That's obvious. The other obvious things are, Cyberpunk lied to everybody. They played dumb with everybody, explaining that, we didn't know that there was really a problem. That's obviously bullshit. So they lied, they played dumb, they manipulated everybody, and they threw away their own belief system. They very much almost reminded me of Blizzard of yesteryear, saying, the game's done when it's done, which is a great philosophy. It's unfortunately one they just didn't follow. But, they're not the first company to, release a broken game. We have what? So we had Fallout 76 by Bethesda, huge fucking failure on launch. We had Anthem, the most recent case aside from Cyberpunk, which was released and was also a failure. Then we had No Man's Sky, which literally promised the sky, didn't deliver. And then way before that, and this isn't just a Western developer problem, we had Square Enix with its release of Final Fantasy XIV as well, which in turn became, the greatest comeback story of all time, I would say, in terms of a video game. But it's just unfortunate that it had to be a comeback story in the first place. So it just really sucks that, this is a place that we're currently at, because I think a lot of people are hoping there's going to be a lot of change after this. That Cyberpunk will have learned its lesson, and I think they probably learned it at least for a good while. And that things will hopefully change within the industry. That people are going to want, finished, complete, polished games, and that it's not worth it for a studio to release an unfinished game. But if that were the case, why the hell does it keep happening? All these... Final Fantasy XIV should have been the first great and last example, but it wasn't. It keeps happening over and over again. And it seems like game developers are incapable of looking at their peers and learning, their lessons through observation. They almost seemed determined to make the mistake themselves in order to learn properly from it, which is boggling to me. It's like watching your buddy piss on an electric fence, and all of a sudden you decide, it's like, you know what? I'm going to do that same exact thing because it's not going to affect me the same way. Or it just, it's not going to hurt, or what the fuck ever. I just don't get it. I guess reputation doesn't matter that much. Or maybe it only matters to a certain point. Maybe at a certain point, reputation isn't as important anymore and money is more important. And I guess maybe, it comes to a certain point with video game companies, I feel, that reputation might get in the way of profits. That's almost the only way these types of actions make sense to me. It has to. I almost feel like this can't be a fucking accident that all these companies keep doing the same thing over and over again, and they're incapable of learning. And I hope they all, No Man's Sky has, gotten leaps and bounds better since that game's release. Fallout 76 has gotten much better. Anthem, it's too early to tell because it's still only been about a year since that game released. And, these games are improving. They are getting better. It's just, why the fuck can't you just wait a little bit? You're just setting yourselves back by releasing these broken games. And you're creating a lot of ire with your fan base, which I just can't see being a good fucking thing. But it obviously, once again, fucking almost has to be. By the fact that these companies keep doing the same thing over and over again. And I think, unfortunately, the problem is I want there to be change. I don't want there to be crunch anymore. And that makes it hard as someone who loves video games to buy certain video games sometimes. Like The Last of Us Part 2, it sweeped all the awards this year, but it was renowned in terms of, how it was developed in terms of the amount of crunch that company had to go through. And even when CD Projekt Red said, oh, we're doing crunch, but we're paying for it. At the same time, when I heard that, I was kind of like, so the fuck what? If I was working for the man, and we've all worked for the man before, and I'm given the option, it's like, oh, I want you to work Saturday, Sunday, but I'll pay you. But if I had the option between that or staying home or going home in a decent hour, I'd be like, fuck you, I'm going home. Right? And I think a lot of people would have that train of thought. It's like, all of a sudden it's magically okay that you have to work overtime just because, we're paying you to. It's like, well, I didn't really get a fucking option. Right? God, I hope this is an angry rant. I'm really trying for it not to be. I just, it's just frustrating to see the game industry in this state. And unfortunately, I don't see it really changing because I don't think the video game industry knows how. They've become so dependent on crunch, a lot of these big developers. They don't know how to get away from it. It's almost like the restaurant industry in North America. They're so dependent on, servers and cooking staff getting tips. If we ever went away from that, they wouldn't know how to keep themselves open, I feel. They wouldn't know how to pay their staff and make a profit because they're so dependent on other people paying, their wage for them in the form of tips. I worked in the restaurant industry as a waiter. I depended on those tips for my livelihood. And, and that's, very much a North American thing. In Europe and Asia, they have decent wages, but it's just, it very much smacks of that. It's just the North American restaurant industry, I feel, doesn't know how to get away from that, that form of functioning. And I feel like the video game industry as a whole is very much in there as well. They just don't know how to get out of the hole they've dug in terms of all this fucking crunch and just having unrealistic deadlines. And the one thing about this whole Cyberpunk story that I absolutely loved, this was very much a sticking it to the man moment, is they had like an emergency, I guess, all hands on deck conference call. And the developers were able to shoot questions to upper management. And essentially they said, why, about a year ago, why did you lie and say the game was playable? In a fully playable state, it just needed to be, have the wrinkles ironed out. And super non-committal. And then the even better one was, don't you think it's hypocritical that we are making a game about, corporate greed essentially as the main antagonists, and yet you're forcing us to work overtime? So, even from that, you can see it's like, even though they were getting paid to work that overtime, they weren't happy about it. They weren't happy about it in the slightest. So I just, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens from this. Unfortunately, I think this, the news cycle will carry on. This won't be forgotten completely, but it won't have, the impact that it should in terms of promoting real change. I think it will a little bit, possibly. I think, all of these events have been like little stepping stones towards a greater change, but I don't think we're going to get anything crazy, within the next couple of weeks about, wide range industry change of any significant type, which is unfortunate. I wish that were the case, but I just don't think it is. I almost feel like game developers have to fucking unionize, honestly. It seems like it's the only way they're going to get out of this mess. But no, I just feel bad for them. And, people can say, oh, just don't work, for that company if there's crunch, or don't work for the industry. It's just like, well, then we won't have video games. It seems from a lot of these companies. I know not every company does it, but a lot of them do. So it's just really fucking unfortunate. And I just wanted to talk about it because this was something I was just going to let pass by, but the story just got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And I'm just like, and I talked to my good friend about it for like a fucking solid hour the other night. Just coming from the lines of like, what were they thinking? But it almost seems to me, that they were so deep in the shit, and I feel like their investors or whoever, what was just behind the scenes, just really grilling them to release the game. And it doesn't help when they get pressure from us fans too, right? In the form of, you know, people sending death threats and other ridiculous garbage their way. That doesn't help either. You know, and I'm able to be a little bit more objective with this game because while I was really looking forward to Cyberpunk, it wasn't like my be-all end-all game. Like if this was Final Fantasy VII Remake and this happened, I would be beside myself because, you know, I just loved that game to death. And I love that, you know, that series to death as well. So I can understand why a lot of people are really upset. Because this was supposed to be, you know, the game of the year of 2020, but, you know, or 2021 because it kind of missed the Game Awards and all that. You know, so I get people are super frustrated and they feel cheated. You know, I was planning on playing this game maybe about, you know, 3 months after release just because I was busy, you know, playing other games. And, you know, I knew there were bugs. It's like, oh, wait for them to iron them out a little bit. I might be waiting a good year now to play this game. You know, wait till the PS5 version comes out and all, like a bunch of these bugs are, you know, eradicated. Because I want to play, you know, a good game. And I think it will be a good game. I think this will be an absolutely fucking solid game in a year. Because by and large, you know, I think, you know, it is a good game. It's just with all the bugs and all the crashes, it just makes it damn near unplayable. And it's just immersion breaking mess. No, so, you know, I just think the answer maybe is for, you know, video game developers to unionize, you know, in order to protect themselves and maybe, you know, maintain the quality of the games that come out too. Because financially speaking, this couldn't have been the way to go about it. You know, I couldn't have seen, you know, the financial consequences of delaying the game another 6 months or a year being as bad as they've been for the company over the last, couple of weeks. I can't fathom that. Maybe I'm wrong, but that blows my mind that this could have possibly been the better decision, which is insane to me. But no, once again, I just hope, you know, the industry, you know, starts learning its goddamn lesson. You know, it hasn't yet because developers keep doing this thing. I almost wonder if it's just going to, you know, the lesson will be learned, but it's going to be on an individual, you know, developer or company basis is almost what the trend seems to be. You know, it's just really sad because, you know, CD Projekt Red was the golden boy and now they've fallen from grace. And I don't think after this there should ever be a golden boy again. Because if they can fall like this and, you know, BioWare and Square Enix and whatever, then everyone can. You know, no one's safe from this type of disaster if you get greedy and you don't listen to your developers, which is I am, you know, in all of these instances, whether it's Final Fantasy XIV or Anthem or No Man's Sky or Fallout 76 or Cyberpunk, you know, people had to be ringing the goddamn alarm bells off. You know, there would have been at least a couple of people being in the room being like, unless you got nothing but yes men at your company, which you never fucking want. You always want people telling you the thing you don't want to hear. As hard as it is to hear that sometimes, you know, because, you know, I feel like if they had listened to those voices, they would have saved themselves a lot of trouble. So anyway, I just, you know, I'm hoping some good comes out of this. I really, truly am. You know, because I would have waited another year. Easily. Everyone would have, because we already waited 6 or 7. You know, what's 8? If it's an excellent experience. You know, but unfortunately, these companies, maybe they get too big for their own good. And then, you know, the investors come a knocking. You know, and they want their game released. You know, they want to see that their investment was worth something. And then everyone suffers. So anyway, thanks for joining me for this video, guys. Hope you enjoyed it. I hope this leads to some good for the industry. And I hope that, you know, we all end up winning, you know, by the time this situation is over, whether it's the developers themselves or us consumers. Yeah, it's just a shitty fucking situation. But anyway, here's hoping it'll get better. Thanks for joining me, everybody. I'll see you soon.